Shabbat Shalom again, everyone. I want to speak this morning. I want to move a little bit away from Shabbat Shira, although I'm going to touch on it. And I want us to think a little bit about history, about our corporate history, about the history we learn, about the history we receive, about the history that will be written. I want you to think a little bit about your own history, your personal history. Most likely it's not found in a book, your history, but it is written through your memories and it is written through your lives. You know it from the stories of your family that you were told by your parents and grandparents and other family members. And that history is very often connected to the larger history of our people. For many, your story is a story of exile and a story of newfound freedom on your own parents or grandparents. One of the great tragedies of our displacements and our exiles, often forcible exiles, is that much of our histories were lost. In my own lifetime, like I'm sure many of you, I have met many white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who can recount their histories going back hundreds of years. It's hardly the case with the Jewish people because of displacement. We're fortunate, most of us, if we can go back 3 generations. But we hold as part of our corporate memory, if not personal histories that go far back, the history of our people. And here we do so perhaps more profoundly than other people do. In this realm, we go back thousands of years. History, our history, is a sacred history. It is a holy history. What does it mean? I think we have to go back to the very beginning of our people, where from our stories we are told, from our stories we recall a past. We don't know exactly where we begin, but we have stories about that. We don't know for sure what happened, or even if we were in Egypt, but we have a narrative that we keep alive. It's a sacred narrative. It's a narrative which contains a relationship between God and our people. For there is a link between God and our people that runs through our entire history, because we know that things happen in life to individuals, to us, and to our people that often extend beyond understanding. And we as a people who both don't forget the past and try to make meaning out of the past, do read God into our history. And perhaps that is one of the reasons we are told that there's no exact Hebrew word for history, actually. We use the word historia in modern Israel, modern Hebrew, but that's obviously from the English. We say toldot. And in Toldot, we read about generations of our people. Through time, we add, and through time, we also subtract. We attempt to continuously, however, give meaning to each generation's experience, each generation's existence. These weeks, we are reading what many call the most important piece of literature known to humanity. It's not important because of its language or its style. It's important because of its meaning, what it teaches us. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God brought us out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Is that what happened? Whether or not, there's something in the telling that has kept it alive, and it's created a narrative of meaning that has kept us alive. You and I will sit at the Seder again in a few months. This year, as we have every year, we'll tell the story, and we will try to transmit its lessons to future generations. A number of years ago, 2001 to be exact, my brilliant colleague and friend, author and pulpit Rabbi David Wolpe wrote a few sermons at the beginning and the end of Pesach, where he examined the historicity of Passover. And he said the following. He said, virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agree that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all. Well, by virtue of saying that from the pulpit, it led to a huge reaction. And I know many of you remember the story. Even the Los Angeles Times ran a story under the headline, quote, "Doubting the Story of the Exodus." There were rabbis and congregants who were outraged. And amongst other things, they felt, no, they believed that questioning the truth of this story would destroy faith. And others, many others, came to Rabbi Wolpe's defense. Even the late Kirk Douglas, who had a bar mitzvah at the age of 83 at Sinai, wrote, quote, "Rabbi Wolpe had tremendous courage to stand up and speak about what is essentially a search for truth. And that, the search for truth, is the highest form of Jewish learning." Wolpe forcefully defended his position. He said it's a well-known fact that millions of Jews have doubts about the literal veracity of Bible stories. My sermons emphasize that faith is independent of doubt. I wanted millions of doubting Jews to know that they can still be faithful Jews, Wolpe said. Doubting Jews can be faithful Jews. Virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agrees that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is probably not what happened. If scholarly books are written that question the literal veracity of Bible stories, he said, it doesn't help our credibility to pretend that they don't exist. By discussing these books, we maintain the Jewish tradition of sustaining faith by seeking truth. And then he continued, ignoring the books, on the other hand, conveys a message of fear. We're afraid that science will shake our faith. I don't believe it should. That's why I spoke out. Another leading Los Angeles rabbi, Steve Leader of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, argued, defending a rabbi in the 21st century for saying the Exodus story isn't factual is like defending him for saying that the earth isn't flat. It's neither new nor shocking to most of us that the earth is round, or that the Torah isn't history dictated by Moses to God on Mount Sinai. And Wolpe himself reemphasized his position in a follow-up sermon. He addressed a jammed sanctuary of 1,300 congregants. The Torah is about the spiritual truth of the Jewish people. It's not about the particulars, he said. Let us be brave together. He understood that we are all in a search for a spiritual truth, for deeper understanding of our lives and the life of our people. He was brave, although he didn't see what he did as an act of courage. He simply was sermonizing about the search for truth. I know a great philanthropist, actually someone who davened with us for a number of years. He invested $5 million with archaeological work and with scuba divers looking for chariots at the floor of the Red Sea. And he invested that to no avail. But it didn't shake his faith by any means. He believed in the importance of that story. The importance of the story is what gives our people's lives meaning. There are historical truths. There are scientific truths. And there are truths about our tradition and our tradition of faith. All of them have stories to tell, and all of them contain truth. They all have meaning. It's funny, at this point, when I was writing this sermon yesterday, I received a call from a very important infectious disease doctor in our community, perhaps the one considered to be the most important. An infectious disease doctor, Dr. Hyman, calls me, and he asked me if I would do his son's wedding this coming out November. I was honored, but I said to him, are you going to schedule it now? Do you know what's going to be with COVID then? And this great doctor answers, I can't tell you. It's more a matter of faith. Perhaps you can tell me. And how ironic that conversation was. And it came just at this moment. But throughout this period of COVID, our faith tradition has been working very hard, hand in hand with the science and with the medicine, because we want to get it right. And we want to preserve meaning. We want to preserve religious life, and we want to preserve a community. So back to the narrative of the story. It's a fundamental story that unites our people and in fact may form the most important narrative upon which civilization as we know it is built. The slavery, the redemption, the escape, the arrival at Sinai, the concepts contain the concepts of freedom and human dignity, human responsibility, and law and justice. Generations have kept this story alive, thank God. Generations have kept this book alive, thank God. And we will too. This is the key to our survival. And these are the stories of our elders, our ancestors, our grandparents, and will be amongst the most important stories that we share with our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. This week, I was confronted with the question. The question is, how will these days, the days when American democracy is threatened at its core, and in fact may be dismantled, how will these days be remembered by history? Well, we think we know. We think we know because of our own particular vantage point and the attitudes that we hold. In a very meaningful essay, John Greenspan and Peter Manso, curators at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, imagine it's the year 2086. And in their essay, they describe a ceremony where a statue is unveiled at the Capitol Sanctuary Hall. And it's a statue of that QAnon shaman that we all have a vivid image of in our head. We all remember this guy with his horns and animal pelts, with a sword and a helmet and his ferocious affect. And they said it's not impossible that this would be the case. It may be repellent to us, but it's dependent on who wins the day. As we know, the victor tells the story. And then these two curators from the Smithsonian retell a history. They tell the history of Jefferson Davis and how his statue joined George Washington in that hall 65 years later. Jefferson Davis, a man who fought for slavery. He fought for slavery, and he committed some of the most egregious criminal offense. And Jefferson Davis appeared in that hall looking like that shaman. Jefferson Davis, appeared in court one day looking like that shaman that we now remember so clearly. But he also appeared in that hallway in the Capitol. The authors say it's chilling, but one day that the garbage that was strewn in the Capitol and the signs that said "Stop the steal," those could be relics valued by a changed nation. Chilling. And they could one day be placed next to the draft of the Declaration of Independence. We don't know who's going to write this story. They point to Andrew Jackson and his aggressive populism and how he was revered for generations. But now, because of other stories that have come forward, we understand who he was in history. We understand that he had a desire and an attempt to commit genocide. He led an ethnic cleansing against the Native American population. How will history tell stories? How will history tell the story of these days? Knowing that history can be told by the victor and carry very different stories is so disturbing. We cannot be certain that our version of today will be the one that is remembered. So what do we do? Well, this is what I do. I believe there's a clear call from our tradition, from our narrative in the Torah, and from our history. And that is this. It's about our obligation. It's about our obligation as Jews to keep alive the stories of our Torah, the message of our Torah, the values of our Torah. Let me explain a little more. I don't know if you saw the documentary, Who Will Write Our History? It's a documentary that tells the story of Emanuel Ringelbaum, who was a great historian, and his colleagues, other historians, educators, and rabbis in the Warsaw Ghetto. Those men and women documented everything. Everything they saw, they documented. Every piece of paper they found, they saved. They collected letters and articles and books and diaries and newspapers, and they buried them in the Warsaw Ghetto. They buried them in milk crates and bottles. Their group was known as Oneg Shabbos, Oneg Shabbat. Their work was a form of resistance, but it was a desire to keep alive a history that they feared would be destroyed by the victors. Because of their work, today a very clear picture of life for the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto has emerged, and because of their work, the history will be preserved long after the lives of the survivors. That is why today the stories, all the stories of what we see, have to be documented and have to be told. The documentation of events, the testimonies that we hear being given before Congress, and the testimonies that refuse to be given have to be a part of the history of these days. I would suggest that we hold this in the light of the values that we hold most dear. These are the values that we gain from the stories of our ancient past, the stories of our sacred history. What are these values? They're the values of human dignity, the values of truth and honesty, the values of the acceptance and preservation of law. They define not only us, but they also define America. I believe that's the narrative that reflects the presence of God. It's a narrative that contains transcendent value. It's a narrative that contains God. Listen, I don't know absolute truth. I do know the impulse of our tradition. The faith that we're called upon to uphold is to feel God's presence in freedom, to feel God's presence in decency, in morality, and the values that it demands. That is what is at the core of my faith. That is the history I've inherited from the stories we've been reading. And that is what we learn. It is what we all learn from our slavery, from the plagues, from the redemption, from this miracle at the sea, leading us to Sinai, where we receive a law. Human events are often subjected to human beings, as we know too well. Sometimes the pharaohs of the world bring horrific suffering. I'm sorry, that was not what I intended. The pharaohs of the world bring horrific suffering. Human history must recall them, and the present must speak about them. The way we judge is not based on the influence of power. Rather, we judge by the values we've inherited. That is what we learn as we read history, and from it derive an understanding of the will of God and how that will is present in the world. It's fascinating to note that we survived and told the history even though we were not the victors. Rather, we stayed true to our story, to our Torah, to its history, to our teaching that sees God's hand being ultimately revealed in that history, in justice and in mercy. We'll never stop looking at the past. That is our obligation. We read our sacred literature, including our history, not to return to the past, but to make the future better. And thus we are capable of singing its songs. The history recorded is to move humanity in a path towards greater justice. That's what so many of our parents and our grandparents, they lived for and they died for. And in them, like us, our history lives. We will judge based on the human and divinely inspired values that we hold dear. That's what we must do. And we will commit ourselves to continue to teach the story, to tell, to sing the story That is what makes us Jews. Shabbat Shalom.